Welcome to the Style Free Podcast, where a father and son detail and digress on the wide variety of topics within music, art, family, and culture. Your hosts are Professor Stephen J. Tyson, Sr. and Jr., also known as Dad and Papa. In today's episode, we welcome our first guest, Gary Brown, singer, songwriter, producer extraordinaire.
I would like to say we're absolutely delighted and honored to have Mr. Gary Brown as our first guest on the Style Free Podcast.
Absolutely.
And Gary, for over the past
40
years, has been a singer, songwriter, producer, and composer. And he's worked with literally a who's who in the music business. Iconic artists such as Chaka Khan, Gladys Knight, Justin Timberlake, George Benson, Roberta Flack, and Barry White, just to name a few. With numerous Grammy-nominated projects under his belt. I could go on and talk about this man's accomplishments, but we are just so delighted again and honored for you to be with us on the Style Free Podcast, Mr. Gary Brown.
Oh, man, that was a very nice intro. I hope I can live up to that intro.
Well, I have to tell you, just in full disclosure, Gary and I have known each other since, I guess, forever.
My inception.
Yeah, not almost.
Pretty much.
And we've just known each other through the years. And of course, as an entertainer, we've had the honor to see him perform in New York City, among other places. And we were quite and deeply touched and honored that he sang at my father and Steve's grandfather's memorial celebration in Manhattan. So that endeared you with us forever and ever.
Oh, well, you know, your dad was a special person for our family. My father adored your dad, man. My father didn't like him. He's a bit of a misanthrope. He didn't like a whole lot of people. And that's just the honest good truth. But he loved him from time, man. He loved your dad.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Gary. And, we are family.
Absolutely.
And,
we are family.
And Gary is the youngest of the children of William, as you just mentioned, and Phyllis Brown. And I think the first time we actually met was when you were living in Mount Vernon.
Probably, yes. Yes.
And you were living with the Thomases.
That's right. My father and Maceo Thomas, well, my father and mother and Maceo and Margie lived in a split level house together. That's exactly. I think they bought the house together. They were on that little entrepreneurial thing. And they bought that house on 2nd Avenue, which was right off of Sanford Boulevard, around the corner from Memorial Park, Memorial Field. When we moved, I was only 3. My oldest brothers had gone, I think Stephen went to Mount St. Michael for a minute. My parents went to A.B. Davis. My mom's side, and dad's side, where everyone was from Mount Vernon.
Oh, okay.
We have serious ties to Mount Vernon. The money earning was definitely in our blood and veins. And of course, proud to be, as you know, Denzel's from Mount Vernon.
Sure.
A lot of, you got my man.
Heavy D from there?
Heavy D's from Mount Vernon. Ken Singleton is from Mount Vernon. Gus and Ray Williams from Mount Vernon.
Wow.
So lots of great luminaries come from Mount Vernon originally.
And of course, Ruby and Ozzie Davis. Ruby D and Ozzie Davis lived there.
Well, and my dad actually worked in the post office with Ozzie Davis at some years ago.
Wow.
When Ozzie was just starting, I guess, off and on between, how it is when you're an actor or an actress.
Yeah.
He, I guess, would work in the post office between gigs. And that was obviously a good gig for, especially an African-American back then. And yeah, he worked in the post office with Ozzie for a little bit of time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then when you were 3, you then moved to Hartsdale, is that right?
Yes, we moved to Hartsdale, to Greenburgh. Actually, one of the main reasons we moved there was because there was something going on in a town we grew up in that was being called the Princeton Plan. And it was a test for integrating the school system there. And that was a big part of the reason my parents decided to move there, because there was the Hartsdale school system and then the Greenburgh, the White Plains. So there's like kind of the black area town, the white area town, and they integrated the school. And it was called the Princeton Plan. And that was a very big part of why my parents had decided to move us up there.
Oh, okay. Wow. I didn't know. I know that your parents, and certainly I remember a story about your mother going to the March on Washington.
I don't know. I know that there's an incredible picture of my mom with Martin Luther King from a fundraiser. She might have been there. She doesn't really discuss that. I don't know. I'm not sure. She's never told me if she was at the March on Washington or not. Mm-hmm. I know that both my parents were very, involved in the civil rights.
Yes.
And they were very active in that. My dad even is especially so, and on a local level as well. And I didn't even know about a lot of that till later in life. I didn't realize my dad was as actively involved as he was. But, my father was, grew up with nothing, basically, with not much. And so, he did, as did all of our parents, in the ins and outs. Many of them came from limited resources, and he was one of those people that equity was a huge thing with him. He was very sensitive about that type of thing, his politics, so that was a big part, as was with your parents.
Oh, yeah.
Your grandparents, Steve Jr.
Yeah.
They were all very, very actively a part of that time period. Was it's the 60s, and let's even go from the late 50s into the 60s. There was a lot of movement going on in that direction. There was a lot of turmoil going on. We forget that they were raising children during all that, and me being as young as I was during that period, I wasn't really aware of what was going on. But when you think about the fact that they were raising kids and dealing with all the political and civil strife, the mid to late 60s were a serious period, man.
Yes. And in fact, to that point, when you mentioned the ins and outs, I should take a moment to mention that the ins and outs was started in the early 50s by a group of women, many of whom went to college together, and they created essentially a network where the families, as the children were being raised, they would share information, talk to one another about what was going on in the world and how they could support each other and their families. And even practical things.
So you mentioned your parents and their intention with moving to a certain area just so that they could have better educational opportunities for the kids in the schooling. And so did being in a different school system or an integrated school system, or in my assumption, a school system that had more resources than what would have been provided to you, provide you with the opportunity to explore music and explore some of your creative endeavors in certain ways?
You know what? That's a really good question. And the reality is that might not have been the case had I just gone to a school system that was integrated, but there was something very, and I know a lot of people probably say this, but there was something very unique about the school system in the area in which we grew up. So our area, I would say back then, it was basically African-American, Italian, Irish, and Jewish. Okay, those were the main. And our school system was very arts-centric, especially our high school. And so there was a lot of creative talent that came. I mean, John Shear, the photographer, came from there. You have to remember also in Greenburgh, Cab Calloway lived in our area. Gordon Parks lived in our area. Ted Shear, the comic who did, the first Black comic in the New York Times, which was Quincy, lived in our area. Moms Mabley lived in our area. So our area was, and Atlantic Star came out of our area. A lot of creative people came out of our area, and our high school was very liberal, and thus the liberal arts were a very, very important part of our curriculum. So yes, to that question, I got a chance to do all kinds of things. And obviously a big part of it also is when your parents work hard to give you opportunities that they didn't have. When you come from a middle-class background rather than a lower middle class or impoverished background, you have a lot more opportunity to experiment and explore than you would if, the situation were more difficult, or you had to get out of high school and help your family take care of the younger kids, or, all the things that go on. So I was very blessed in that way. Now, none of my older brothers were creatives. So I was a bit of a anomaly in my family. Probably like, where did this thing come from? Like, why is he doing these weird things that none of the other kids do? You know what I mean?
There must have been, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just curious. There must have been music in the house. I mean,
but to be honest with you, it's interesting you say that too, because there wasn't that much music in the house. And I know Now, I didn't find out till years later that my cousin, who's a musician, told me that my father was this huge jazz fan.
Wow.
But I think he had some of his jazz records still, but I don't remember my dad really coming home and listening to music very often.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had older brothers, so therefore they were listening to what they were listening to. But my oldest brother, Stephen, was more into like the rock thing.
Mm.
That's what Integration will do. And I was kind of more into Sly Stone. Sly Stone was my idol.
Wow. What was it about Sly's music that caught your attention early on?
Obviously, Sly and Family Stone were an incredible amalgamation of pop, rock, gospel, soul, everything, right? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have to remember, I was young. That music was very approachable. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, Hot Fun in the Summertime or Stand or any of those songs. They were pop songs. They were brilliantly written and arranged pop songs, but they were pop songs. And you have to remember, when we were coming up, they played everything on the radio. You know, it wasn't just, you know, not now where everything's kind of broken into like little micro areas. When we were coming up, the radio stations played everything from Sly Stone, and then you might hear the Doors or you might hear the Beatles. Of course, my ear always went towards soul music for whatever reason that is. And I'll never forget, we were in 7th grade. I already was in a band. I was in like a band in the 5th grade. And we had this band called Inner City Funk. I'll never forget. There was nothing inner city about us, but you know, but our music teacher was young, and she turned us on to Earth, Wind & Fire. Okay, and we were digging Earth, Wind & Fire, man. And she took us on a class trip. Not all of us, about 9 of us, to see Earth, Wind & Fire open for Sly and the Family Stone.
Oh, that's crazy!
Wow.
It was. First of all, I was so excited that Sly Stone was even the same building I was standing in. It was unbelievable. See, back then was a very different time because you didn't see your idols and musical idols on videos and on TV, or like you didn't hear their voices other than singing, other than records. So to just hear them speak or just to see them, you know, in any other capacity was a big, big deal.
Yeah. This way before MTV and all of that.
Right, exactly. They didn't have music videos and all that kind of stuff. So just being in that room, just knowing even though the room was Madison Square Garden, but still, it was literally magical. Also, could have been the fact that it was the first time I smelled weed. You know.
But what year was this?
This must have been 1971 or 72, maybe.
Oh, wow.
Maybe
that's
70.
right, because EWF was just coming out the box, you know, pretty much.
Maybe 72, 73. Yeah. And, you know, back then, we hadn't pulled the curtain on Oz yet. And by that, I mean, the music industry was still magical. We didn't know about the artists, what they made for a living or where they lived or their personal issues. All we knew was the music and the concerts, and any little bit of them that you could see was so inspiring and affected you so deeply. Well, I think it's unfortunate for young people now is that the magic, you know, the curtain's been pulled. You know how things are created, you know how they're made, you know how records are sold, and you know what? We didn't know anything about that. So as a young artist, it was so inspirational. And I had known by that point that I wanted to be in entertainment in some capacity anyway. But that show changed everything. It was like, I have to do that. And what's really interesting is around that time, Jungle Boogie came out. I was in the 7th grade. I'll never forget, Jungle Boogie was like the biggest record, you know, for the brothers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that was hard. That was like, for us, Jungle Boogie was like hardcore hip hop would be now.
Right.
It was like, it was funky. It was raw.
And that was, wasn't that Ronald Callis Bell?
Absolutely. That was Kool Gang.
Yeah. Who you would later be on.
I would later work with. And if you would have told me, because we all loved Jungle Boogie and Hollywood Swinging and Summer Madness. If you would have told me then, in about, let's see, if I was 12, in 14 years, you'll be singing on stage with those guys. I would have thought you were out of your mind.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was, but I always had idols. It was, Sly, and then Marvin Gaye, and then it became George Benson. And then around George Benson, it was Al Jarreau too. I literally had a cat in college I named Al Benson. And, and once again, if you would have told me some years later I would write for Al Jarreau and for George Benson at some point, I would have thought you were crazy. But I always had an idol at any particular time in my musical kind of journey. There was always someone that was like the pinnacle to me. Of what I thought was the high bar, was the greatness. Of course, look, Stevie Wonder's in there, Michael Jackson's in there, they're all in there.
Yeah. Another point, you had mentioned that with all of these musical heroes, that at the same time, you also had this love for, I guess, the American Songbook or the, some of those classics.
Yes.
I mean, you're talking about Ella or Frank Sinatra and Nat and all of that. So how did that, was that concurrent with what was going on then at that time?
I wasn't on to Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra like I would be in later years. But the music of Ellington, Billy Strayhorn, the great composers, because I did some cabaret. See, first of all, I was a music theater kid in high school too. So that kind of brings you a little closer to that element. But then when I got out of college, I was doing the smaller clubs like McKell's, the Cellar. Actually, the Cellar, I did more R&B stuff. But some of another place, Green Street Cafe, a place called Cattail. Some of those places kind of called for more of doing some of the classics. Some of the audiences were older. It was a little bit kind of an upscale kind of environment. And once again, in my school, our music program and our theater program, Mrs. Feller was my music theater teacher, who turned us on to such incredible music. Everything Must Change, from the Body Heat album, she turned me on to.
Oh, okay.
And,
wow.
And so
Quincy Jones, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I got turned on to Ellington as well as Dinah Washington and Ella and, all the greats fairly early on, because I always felt that music to some degree, in some ways, was the most challenging.
In what way?
Well, first of all, just dealing with the intervals that are written in jazz music, singing and developing an ear for not only singing the intervals that are written in great jazz songs, but also because I was trying to learn how to scat because of Al Jarreau, obviously. Then you've got to start paying a little bit more attention to theory and a little bit more attention, to knowing your scales. I always wanted to be more than just like a guy who was a one-trick pony. I wanted to be able to do different types of music. And to me, if you can, I don't want to say master, because I haven't mastered anything, but if you can find your way in the jazz idiom and working in that area, and even during the fusion jazz period, as you well know, in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, then if you can do that, you're going to develop an ear that will come in very handy later in life. And it did, because it helped me later as a producer and with arranging background vocals and just hearing things that I don't think I would have heard had I just stayed in one idiom. To be honest with you, the greatest compliment a musician ever gave me was they said, you're a singer, man, but you're a musician. And coming from a jazz artist, that's a real compliment, because there are many singers who do everything by ear and they're great, don't get me wrong. But when a musician hears that you can hear the harmony, the fifth or the flattened, note, and they know that you can hear that when picking up a part or even in arranging a part, that's a great compliment as a singer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's so true. It's something that I've also been learning over the past few years and immersing myself more deeply in, as far as understanding theory, understanding certain aspects of just musicality that has helped to shape and create the audio foundation for everything that I'm doing right now and will continue to do.
Well, I feel that, because, you're a hip hop cat, you know what I mean? And I tell my son this because he's also a rapper. I've always said, look, I know you're into hip hop and that's dope, but listen to everything.
Yeah.
Listen to everything, because there are very few people who've created music idioms. Like Miles Davis has created music idioms. Okay. Very few people have created music idioms. So most of the time when you hear something that's fresh and new, it's a fresh take on a combination of other music idioms, right?
Wow,
Someone who comes and takes pieces of other things and creates a salad, let's say, that you've never tasted before, but it's still taking from a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this.
Yes.
So I think that if you want to create fresh art, you've got to have a palette to draw from. You can't just listen to the stuff that you're doing personally. If I'm doing R&B and soul, if all I do is eat, drink, and sleep R&B and soul, then I'm not going to be in a situation where I can start bringing interesting elements of, let's say, jazz or gospel or even country, let's say, into my music to create something that's fresh, because all I'm doing is drinking this one type of drink all day long.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think that even rappers and the best rap producers obviously have done that. And when you think about some of the stuff from Tribe Called Quest and then Cats, you know what I mean? It was innovative because they were grabbing from other music idioms.
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Now, as a songwriter, you went to Syracuse University. You were theater major and also a English minor?
Yeah, I minored in English because I didn't want a BFA. I wanted a BS.
Okay.
Bachelor, only because I thought maybe it would come more in handy later in life. And of course, the being the English minor, I think I'm glad I did that because it's helped me in writing. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't thinking that then, but when I think back on it, it's come in handy. But, it's interesting because I went to school to study acting and not even music theater, like straight acting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wasn't in music theater. I was in a band. I was in different bands throughout my college experience. Okay. But I wasn't a music theater major, which is interesting because I tell you, you never know what you're going to use. Also, in the music theater program when I was there, oh God, I always forget his name. He's one of the greatest screenwriters that's alive today, who did Moneyball and A Few Good Men. He's huge. Anyway, he was in the music theater department when I was there, and you would have never thought I don't think he did anything in music theater. He ended up becoming a screenwriter. So, you go and get these majors and then you're like, okay, well.
Aaron Sorkin?
Aaron Sorkin. Thank you very much. He was in my class. Steve, you might know this. When I was 14 or 15, I started doing like TV commercials and stuff like that and was going to go into acting. But, I'll be very honest with you. One of the problems that I ran into was my shade of color. And what they used to say then is we really liked him, but we need someone a little more urban. Not brown skin enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I lost a lot of gigs because of that. And the other thing for acting for me was I was always someone that wanted to do. I want to do. And the thing about acting in theater is I didn't like the idea that I had to be cast before I could work. I had to wait for someone to say, okay, we're going to choose you. You can work now. With music, I could start working right away. I could go do clubs. I could be singing immediately. You know what I mean? Like, I was never one who was patient when it came to waiting to do my craft. That's one of the reasons I think I kind of went more towards music than theater, which I loved. Don't get me wrong. But music was immediate.
But you say you also brought some of that theater experience, the idea of telling a story, through motion and stagecraft and all of that kind of found its way to the clubs, didn't it?
Oh, no doubt. Well, first of all, I'm a ham, so that's going to be in there regardless. But no, it absolutely does. Look, let me tell you something. If you look at Frank Sinatra, who's also an actor, right?
That's right.
I remember Quincy Jones talking about Frank Sinatra once, and he was saying how this man, people didn't realize what he was doing, but this man knew exactly when to flick his cigarette or touch his hat. It was all choreographed. All the things you see great stage performers like him do, you think that they're just doing them organically. And to some degree, maybe they are. But Frank Sinatra was such a consummate artist that he knew how to sit back and put his arm up and when to turn his head. It was all part of a pantomime of pulling the audience in. And that is something that I think, not comparing myself to Frank Sinatra by any means. What I'm saying is that theatrical background definitely comes in handy when you're trying to entertain an audience. Because when you're doing, let's say, a small nightclub, okay, and it's just a piano and you, and that's, I tell you, that's where you cut your teeth, brother. You know, you got a microphone, a piano, and you. And you have a room full of people who live in New York, so they've seen it all.
Right.
Okay? And you have to entertain them for 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't stand flat-footed. Now, if I was, David Peaston or something, maybe I could do it. But to just stand and you can't, there's only but so much blowing away vocally you can do to people in 40 minutes to an hour. You've got to entertain them too. Unless you're singing like hit songs that are your hit songs, then you can get away with that. But when you're trying to entertain a crowd who doesn't know who you are, and you have 40 minutes, you can't just try to riff them to death. You got to entertain them. You got to talk to them. You got to lead into songs. And that's where the whole theatrical background really came in handy doing the nightclubs in New York.
So anytime you have a lyric, whether you wrote it or whether another artist wrote it, I would imagine you inhabit those words, or that there's a story there that you, like an actor, you step into that space. Could you talk about that, just the stagecraft, the approach that way?
Well, what's really interesting is, first of all, you're 100% right. A lyric, you want to sell a lyric, right? You want to sell the story. So I think that part of it for me was almost innate because I had been an actor. Because what's really interesting, and I hate to admit this right now, there are a lot of songs of other artists that I've sang through the years that I didn't even really pay as much attention to till later and go, oh, that's what that song was about. Because melody was always what hit me first with a song.
Oh, okay.
And I know that sounds like you think he's an actor, he's going to be into the lyric. I think that came because I just knew how to work lyrics because I was an actor. But melody is like, even when I write, some people write lyrics and then they create melodies around them. Melody is always the strong suit for me. Writing, I usually write melodies first before I write lyrics. When I hear a song, it's the melody. Sometimes I'll hear a song and love it and listen to it 10, 15 times before I even really pay attention to the lyric.
When the melody comes to you, does it come to you in a particular key? In other words, have you discovered over the years that you're attracted to a particular key in a song? And do you write in that key?
Well, first of all, I do not only write in one key because I think that keys have colors. And sometimes I might write the song in the key, but then say, you know what, let me try this a half step up or a whole step up. But E flat minor is probably my favorite key because it's soulful and it's minor keys. Of course, most people like minor keys, right? Especially
Why is that?
Because they're more emotional sounding. And E flat minor is a key I just love because, first of all, I love playing it on the keyboards because it's not a difficult key to play in, but also the sound of, and my voice is good in that key. But I don't necessarily choose the key I'm going to write a song in because usually if I hear a melody in my head, whatever key that melody is in, now maybe a lot it ends up being E flat minor, but that's not conscious. But I try to write in a lot of different keys only because I think that the same song does not sound the same in another key. You know what I mean? It does change the color of a song. And even if you're staying in a minor key, you know what I mean? It changes the color of a song when you change the key. Sometimes the energy changes.
So that's interesting. The energy changes. So when you're commissioned to write a song for a particular artist, when you're thinking of the melody, do you think of that in the key that you're familiar with? Or do you think of it in terms of the key that particular artist is comfortable with?
No, I never think about the artist's key. Look, let me tell you something about writing for other artists. Pretty much every time I tried to write a song for a particular artist, I failed. And by that, I mean, you always assume when you're writing, and this is my experience. I don't want to say this is everyone's experience. You always assume, okay, that's that artist's vibe. I'm going to write in that vibe. But that artist is thinking, I did that already. I don't want you giving me more of that. Okay, but you're thinking as a songwriter, let me give them their thing. Most of the songs that I've had cut by the Barry Whites, the George Bensons, Al Jarreau, most of the time, I hadn't written the song for that artist. Like the stuff that George Benson did, those are supposed to be for an album I was working on for myself. So
Okay.
my manager at the time took him to Tommy LaPuma, who did the Breezin' album and the Unforgettable album with Tommy was an icon, and he was going to try to get me a record deal with Tommy.
Mm-hmm.
And Tommy was like, "Look, I can't sign anybody right now, but man, I'd like to play these for George." And so I didn't know this was going on, and so my manager comes to me and says, "Look, they're not signing right now, but he really wants them for another artist." I'm like, "Man, no, I'm not giving up my stuff for some artist." Right? Now, one day I'm living in Los Angeles at the time. I'm in the crib, and I get a phone call. Gary Brown there. I'm like, "This is Gary." "What's happening, Gary?" It's George Benson. I was like, "Yeah, okay. Who is this, man? Who is this, man?" Like, "George, brother. This is George." And I'm like, "Who is this, man?" And finally, I get it. I'm like, "Whoa, wow." Now, think about it. I told you George was my idol when I was younger.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Man, them songs, man. I love them songs, brother, man. I would really, really love to do them." Had it been almost anybody else but a George Benson or a Stevie Wonder, somebody like that, I'd have been like, "Yo, man, I'm not trying to give up my material." Right. But it was George Benson, man.
Wow.
And, it was, and one of my dreams was to hear George Benson scatter on a song that I had written. The guitar.
Wow. So what songs were they?
I think one of them, Holding On.
Yes, Holding On was one.
Man, I just want to say about that song, Gary, I never heard him sort of release himself in that way on that song when he starts scatting and with the guitar like he did back in the day. Yes. I mean, he just let go. I mean, it's the beat, the lyric. I mean, everything is fantastic on that song.
No, he killed that song, man. And that was one of the ones that became #1 Billboard jazz album on the Billboard chart. So that was fun. I'll tell you, that whole period of time with George was so amazing. He was so gracious to me. I can't even begin to tell you. He came right around that time period. He came to LA to get his star on the Hollywood, on the Walk of Fame. Mm-hmm. He invites me to the luncheon for that. Then he invites me to his show at Universal Amphitheater that night, announces me at the show. We take pictures with the plaque that night.
Wow.
Invites me to his house sometime later. I'm sitting with him in this beautiful room he had. He lives in Englewood, New Jersey. And then he came down to the studio when I was doing the backgrounds for it. Actually, a very interesting story. Flavor Flav came down to the studio the day that I was doing those backgrounds, and George had no idea who Flavor was. And Flavor had his clock on and had all his whole Flavor Flav gear. Had it all
the clock and the whole thing.
Oh, had the whole thing. And George is like, "Who is this brother, man? Who is this? Who is this?" He's looking at this guy. Who's this clown, man?
That's hilarious.
Man, let me tell you something, man. Flavor Flav charmed George. It was amazing. Flavor Flav ain't what you think, man.
Yeah.
Flavor is a pretty erudite cat. He knew all of George's music. Going back to before he sang. Man, I love the White Rabbit album when he did it. And I watched George Benson just melt in his hands. And by the end of the night, we're all hanging out, and him and Flav were like homies.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Wow. And Flav was a drummer too.
Was he?
Yeah. He was a drummer too.
That makes sense because he really knew his stuff, and he knew George's stuff, man. He really knew his music. Yes. It was an interesting evening.
That's not something most people would understand. They would not know that.
I was surprised. I mean, I was like, wow, he really knows his stuff. And it was an interesting thing to watch. These two people from completely different music idioms just blend and mesh and just fall in love with each other that night. Yes. It was, I got a lot of, you talk about the songwriting stuff. I never thought I was going to be a songwriter. I always saw myself as an artist, as a singer. I didn't even start writing my own music till I was in my early 20s, which is late.
That's what I was going to ask you as far as you writing your own songs. Because you're saying that this album with George Benson, or at least your work with him, was around 96, 97, you said?
Yeah, I think it was around, somewhere between 96 and 98, I think, yeah.
Because I remember the Rhythm of Romance album in 92, I think that came out, right?
Yes, it came out in 92, but I started working on it in 90.
Okay.
It took it was a while. That album took a minute.
Yeah, because I think in my personal opinion, your album still stands the test of time when it comes to that New Jack Swing sound in that song.
Man. Yeah, thank you.
For sure.
You know, it's interesting because people now, when they think back of that record, think New Jack Swing because there's a lot of New Jack stuff on there.
Yeah.
I was never really considered myself or, saw myself as a New Jack Swing artist. But that time, Teddy Riley created such an incredible friggin' vibe that everybody was using.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if it's an up-tempo song during that period of time, it's probably a New Jack vibe. You know what I mean? I mean, Teddy Riley, he does get props, but I don't think he gets the props he really deserves because everybody was doing New Jack. I mean, even Jimmy and Terry and LA and Babyface were doing New Jack grooves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know
and
what I
that's
mean?
what, and Michael heard that, right?
Yeah, of course. Remember the time and all the stuff that he did with Teddy? That was all based on the New Jack vibe. And, interesting story too. I remember meeting Teddy Riley. He must have been 16 years old. I was gigging at the Cellar. And a friend of mine, a young lady, I can't remember her name right now. She did the duet, Make It Last Forever with Keith Sweat, his sister. And
Shantae Moore?
No. I was before Shantae.
Oh, Jackie McGee.
Jackie, that's what it was. So Jackie's like, yo, Gary, I want you to come out and meet this, this little young friend of mine. I was like, well, tell him to come in. He was like, well, he can't come in. I was like, why? He's like, he's only 16. I was like, oh shit. So I go outside. There's a little young Teddy Riley. Yo, man, what's happening? I was like, we tried to sneak him in. I don't think we can sneak him in that night. But literally, like a year and a half or 2 years later, Awana came out, and it just got paid. And it was history. You know what I mean? I should have grabbed his butt then and been like, yo, work on my record. I didn't even have a record.
That's wild.
That's the thing about living in New York, right? The people you run living in New York. But I guess so much what I was saying is I wasn't thinking of being a songwriter or a producer. You know what I mean? But once again, I always felt I don't want to be a one-trick pony. I don't want to just be a singer. Not that there's anything wrong with that. There's just other things I feel I should learn to do. I always felt if I can write my own material, even if I'm not popping at the time, I can write for somebody else. I can have a career that would last if I can write and produce. And I say that, to young people all the time, have your main thing, but, spread it out a little bit. If you're a director, learn a little bit about editing, or sound mixing, learn the craft and as much, in the arena of the craft as you can. And had I not gotten into writing and producing, my career would have been a little short-lived. You know what I mean?
But I think also that the fact that you were also a performer, you bring that, the sensitivity, the awareness that comes with that and all the work that goes into being a stage performer. That awareness goes to the situation where you're working with an artist that you're producing. Talk a little bit about that process, about being a producer and what goes into that, taking all of the experiences that you've had together into that situation.
Be like working with a singer. Well, I don't think I'll be the first to say this. Being a record producer and producing vocals is a little bit creative, but there's a lot of psychology. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because now if you're dealing with a new artist, it's very different because they really want to please you. They want you to be happy, and they'll do things over and over again, and they'll want you to try this, I'll try that. They're young, they're new, they're excited. But when you're working with an icon, or you're working with someone who is like a Whitney Houston or Gladys or a Shaka or any of those types of people, you don't have that same leeway. They're not going to sing it over and over again just because you want to try some new thing. They're like, sometimes like, could you just try? Well, okay, well, what was wrong with that? They're not going to just give you 6 hours in the studio. They got things to do.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So that sometimes becomes challenging. And there's been some times in the studio with some icons where one of them, I tried to do my little psychology, thing. And the artist was like, don't try that psychology bullshit on me. Let's just get back in the studio. I'm not going to say who it was, but you know who the person is. And so it can be challenging when you're dealing with celebrity in the studio. Not always, because like James Ingram I worked with once, and he was I'm over here like a little nervous about asking him about certain things. And, could you just try, or you do mind if? He's like, brother, I'm here for you, brother. I'm here for you, brother. And he was amazing. I mean, he was just a wonderful, sweet human being. And most of the time it's good, but sometimes your personalities clash. But you're not going to get along with everybody you meet, whether they're a celebrity or not, right? I mean,
but isn't it something to work with one of your heroes like a George Benson and feel a certain indebtedness, I guess, to some extent, and then to write for him, work with him? Was that in any way intimidating at first, or did it feel perfectly natural? What was that experience like?
Well, the George Benson stuff I didn't produce. Okay, so that was just a writing thing. There was one song that actually wasn't written that I wrote with Curtis Williams, who was a brother that I knew from Kool and the Gang. He's the keyboard player, that we wrote called Summer Love. So we did write for George. It can definitely be intimidating. But like I said, with most of the records that I've had covered by artists, normally they were songs like, look, I'll give you a perfect example. I had a song on the Icon of Love is the Icon, I think is the name of the album. It's a Barry White album that did really well. It had Practice What You Preach on it. And big record. And I will never forget someone going, yo, man, congratulations on that Barry White album. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, well, you got that song on there. And I was like, what? Really? What song? And it was a song I had written with Barry Eastman, who, if you look him up, he's produced and written for everybody. I mean, everybody. That we had written like maybe 3 years before that. And all of a sudden it's on that album because I guess someone from the publishing company presented it and he took it. I didn't even know it was being recorded. So a lot of times there's songs that I had no artist in mind or I had a different artist in mind. Like, for instance, I wrote a song called Falling for that NSYNC ended up doing. We wrote for 98 Degrees.
Oh, wow.
You know what I mean? Now, it usually don't work like that. Usually you don't get the one you want and you go down a little bit. This was like, it went up. Because, 98 Degrees was big, but NSYNC was huge at the time.
Yeah.
They were like the biggest group in the world at the time. And so that song was written for that idiom, but I didn't know Justin Timberlake was going to ultimately sing it. You know what I mean? So a lot of times, for me at least, it wasn't necessarily writing on assignment like that. A couple of times it was. Gladys Knight, when I wrote something for her, it was that. She's, by the way, an absolute class act, sweetest human being in the world, just incredible. But often it was like songs that I had written and, you hand it in the publishing company and then they went out and they got it covered. But when I was producing, often I was writing for the artist in particular. And yeah, it can sometimes be intimidating and sometimes it can just be maddening or difficult because some artists are difficult, and if they walk into the studio with you and they don't necessarily know you, and here now you have to, I am producing, so we're going to work together here, but we do have a little bit of a vision. We're trying to, and vocals can be a very, very intense thing to do, especially back then. We didn't have pitch correction and all of that type of stuff. It's like you had to get that performance. You couldn't fix it in post like you can now. You had to get that performance. And sometimes artists would think, I'm good, but you're like, yeah, but you're really not though. You know what I mean? And it can get a little funky sometimes. Most of the time it's great, but it can get a little difficult. Not like yelling, that kind of thing. I never had anything like that. But where they tell on you sometimes. They tell on you. It's like you get a call from the A&R guy. It's like, yo, such and such manager told me you were giving her a hard time in the studio. I was like, wait, what are you talking about?
It's like you got called to the principal's office.
Yeah, man, you get told on. You know what I mean? That's happened to me on a few occasions. But most of the time, look, by the end of the project or the song, everybody's usually happy, and all the, if there was any issues, it's all swept under the rug and you keep it moving, for the most part. Everyone's good.
What was it like working with Gladys when you did the song If I Were Your Woman too? Because everyone knows If I Were Your Woman and You Were My Man and I Would Do This. But now you're taking that song and you're kind of flipping it in a different way. Writing from the perspective of a woman in this situation, what was that experience like?
Well, And that's interesting because that's one of the songs that I did write with the artist in mind. What I did lyrically was I flipped it in a way where you're almost saying you wouldn't be doing those things if I was actually your woman. In other words, you're doing those things because I'm not your woman yet. So basically, would you continue to do those things if I was really your woman? Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. I've always felt comfortable with writing from a woman's perspective as much as I can, because I feel like certain things are universal. You know what I mean? Not all things, but certain things. Of course, that was a situation where I really wanted to get that. You know, there's certain artists that you just want to have on your discography. And, you know, you think Gladys Knight, that's someone I would just love. She was always one of my favorite singers of all time. I mean, most of my idols, you can tell, are men. But Gladys Knight, I always thought had an amazing voice because, you know, one thing about Gladys, you notice, she don't need to riff, man. She doesn't riff a lot.
Yeah.
It's just the sound and the tenor and timbre of her voice is so pure and real and honest and believable that she don't need to do all that riffing. You believe everything she says.
Yes.
And I really wanted to be able to have worked with her. And the guy who A&R'd that record actually was the brother from American Idol. What was the original brother from American Idol?
Simon Cowell?
No, the brother.
Oh, you know,
What's
Randy Jackson.
What's up, dog? Randy.
What's up, dog?
You know, he used to always say that, right?
Yep.
And he loved the song when he first heard it, but then I heard rumors that they weren't going to use the song. And I was really distraught about that. But then I guess they ended up using it. And then it ended up being the single, not because the label chose it, but because Tom Joyner just started playing. Wow. And he has so many, you know, he's affiliated throughout the country. So it just became the single based because Tom Joyner decided it was going to be, basically.
That's wild. I'm just floored that there are so many songs that you wrote that were playing either on the radio or even in my friends and my CD players back in high school that I had no idea, especially listening to that NSYNC Celebrity album. But I had no idea that you were the one who wrote that.
You know, it was interesting. I was doing a lot of like mature artists at the time, and I really wanted to write something for a younger group.
Yeah.
Like that was one thing I felt like, it would just be nice to like be able to write something for like this generation. Like I said, we had written it for 98 Degrees. I guess they passed on it. And then one of the guys who I was working with had a relationship with, I think, one of the members of the group. It wasn't Justin though. And we went down to Orlando. Justin came in and he did the demo for the whole song. And he was a talent, and he was young. He was a talented little cat. He knocked it out. Because I did the original demo. And then I think he did it as a duet with one of the other guys. Chaz, I think was it. I don't remember all the members of the group. I think it was something Chaz or something like that. And this was the last record they were doing as a group. And they ended up using the song. They did a movie, it was called On the Line. And it was in that film. But I was impressed with Justin at that time. This is before he had started his solo career or anything.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a nice kick because they came to Los Angeles to perform at the Rose Bowl. And my kids were young at the time and they knew who they were, obviously. And we went down and sat, you know, by the stage for sound check and stuff. And then, you know, the kids got to meet them backstage. And they were, you know, obviously very excited because this was NSYNC. I mean, NSYNC, I don't know if you remember this time period. They were huge.
Yes. They were massive.
Oh, they were everywhere. I mean, I think they were selling like 22 million records every time they were out. You know, I'm just like, oh my God. I mean, they were just everywhere. But, you know, so I enjoyed just the fact to be able to write something for younger artists at that point. I just wanted to have that experience.
Yeah.
Now, once again, I didn't produce that. I wrote it, but I didn't produce it. But yeah, man, that was an interesting, there was a lot of stuff out there. You're right, during that time. I forget about a lot of it, to be honest with you. Because you do it and then you have to move on.
And then you move on, yeah.
You know, you can't rest on your laurels, and you know, you're always thinking about the next gig. You know what I mean? And like, you know, other artists you'd like to work with or other artists that are looking, and, you know, those records, they come out and they get out into the world. And that's what's interesting about YouTube though, man. What's nice about YouTube is, as a writer, you can go to the song and hear people's reaction to the song, which you could never do as a songwriter before, because if you're a singer, you can, You go out and you sing your song for the audience and you get that immediate. But as the songwriter, you're not around. You don't, get to enjoy any of those accolades. But you can now go to YouTube and you can see like, wow, I love this song, or this was our wedding song, or this song always made me feel this. And it's kind of nice to be able to read those little notes that people put up there.
Feedback.
Yeah, most definitely. And that, I think that's also something as far as keeping folks' music within the realm of access, because to go back to Rhythm or Romance as an example, I can't go stream that. So I'm lucky enough that Dad had the CD, and so I have the MP3s and I'm able to do that. But because of YouTube, folks can go on and listen to the album, and you still have folks commenting now being like, this is my jam still in 2020. And it's incredible.
Well, what bugs me out about some of the songs on the Rhythm of Romance is like, I see remixes of them, not remixes that we did. Like there's just like young remixers are out there like remixing those songs. I'm like, wow, y'all are still remixing these joints? Because people who are serious, vinyl, because some of that stuff was on vinyl. Serious vinyl heads, they'll go and, dig in the crates. See, I'm one of them cats in the crate now. That's the crazy thing. It's like, I'm putting the records in the crate. Like, I'm like, you got to go digging now. You got, oh, let me check this out. Like, I'm one of those people now. Which is weird to think of, but, they find it. And, what's interesting is they say some pretty cool stuff about it. This was, or someone will say, oh, my mom used to love this record. And even with some of the other artists that I've written for, like, I love when I hear people say things like, oh, this was our wedding song, or, this song got me through a difficult time. I hate to sound corny, but that's what music does, right? I mean, that's what you want to hear when you write a lyric or you write a song and find out that it touched someone, or it helped them in some way, or it changed their life in some small way. Or that's why you do it, right? I mean, that's why you do it. You want to reach people, right? You know that, Steve Jr. I mean, you know how that feels when, you write a lyric that, someone tells you, like, make them look at something in a different way or open their mind up in it, that's got to be the best compliment that you get.
Absolutely. You're 100% right about that.
Yeah. So it's all worth it, man. It's all, because it's not all good all the time. It wasn't always good. I went through some difficult years in the industry. When the music industry, you got to remember, the music industry after file sharing started with the whole Napster thing, the music industry in many ways, at least the industry that I knew, imploded. And, so here I had to reinvent myself from being a singer to being a songwriter and producer. Now I had to reinvent myself again because the producing and the songwriting gigs were drying up because a lot of the artists no longer had record deals. And the labels, weren't pulling in the same kind of money and didn't have the same kind of budgets to do records that they did. A lot of these artists might have kept doing their own records, but they were doing them very, very streamlined and didn't have real budgets like, we were getting. And so I had to reinvent again and start getting into like more composing type stuff. So, it's never just this, man, where it's just a steady climb up or even a steady line across. It's always, for me at least, it's peaks and valleys, man.
Absolutely. I definitely understand and empathize and just feel you on that and sympathize. It's a lot of peaks and valleys to it all. Oh,
absolutely. I would look back and say, a good portion of it was positive and great and all that, but there was some difficult years, man, in those kind of transitional periods. The transition from losing the record deal and then going and becoming a songwriter and a producer was a transition, and then going from songwriter to producer to more kind of composer was a transition. And those little pocket transition periods are not easy periods for an artist, especially if you plan on continuing to try to stay in the industry in one way or the other. A lot of cats that I worked with back in those times didn't even stay in the music industry. They went to teaching or all kinds of other stuff, because that period there was a lot of turnover when kind of the file sharing thing started to take effect, and the record labels, people were basically getting them, the idea of people your age don't think of music as something you pay for anymore. You know, that is a new concept for those of us who've been around. So you have to find a whole new ways of creating revenue streams as a musician or an artist, right? I mean, it's totally different now.
So what has helped sustain you through those peaks and valleys, as you say? And, you know, what kind of vistas are opening up for you at this point? You know, how are you moving forward with your music?
Well, what got me, I think, through the peaks and valleys was two things. One is just always believing that I belonged in the industry in one capacity or another, always feeling I had something to offer. And the other one was just really not wanting to do anything else. The idea of a 9 to 5, man, like was just, that's enough to drive me to do whatever I've got to do. You know what I mean? Because I am not a 9 to 5 cat. I could maybe teaching I could see doing. And I did some. Teaching's different though. Because teaching, you get to, you know, and you know this, Steve, you get to work with someone and see growth and creativity. That's different. But like a job, you know, so it's the fear of that. And just, you know, it's will, really. It's just desire and will to be like, no, okay, I can't do this exactly like this anymore. Or I can't do that, which is going to happen as you get older anyway. You know what I mean? Even if the industry's not changing, you're changing. Yeah. So having spent some time writing and not only writing lyrics and melodies, but learning how to, you know, writing musically allowed me to become better and better at actual composing, which, you know, for either like TV commercials or documentaries or, you know, jingles. Sometimes it was like songs for shows, and sometimes it's just, you know, shorter or longer form content. It kind of started from starting to compose some TV commercial stuff. So in the early 2000s, I started doing more kind of jingles, which is good money when you can get the gigs.
Yeah.
But that's kind of real short form composing, right? And then just slowly, you know, just starting to do longer form stuff, you know, some documentary stuff. And it's a whole different thing. Composing music to picture is a whole different thing from writing a song. It's a whole different place that you have to come from. You're serving now someone else's vision, not your own, right? So you're supporting a director or producer's vision now, okay? You're not the center of the creative process anymore. Now you're a supporting player in the creative process. So you have to learn to write to assignment. You can't just write, you know, you can start from something that you feel that's innate, but then you might, you know, now you've got to do some giving and taking. Now you got to do some, you know, deal with critique and another person's point of view, which is why I think a lot of musicians have a hard time with composing, because you're not the final word anymore. And you have to do it on time. You got to do it within budget. And you have to give that director or that producer what they're looking for, not just the way you see it. So that becomes challenging too, and not necessarily easy. And, you know, but I enjoy it as much as songwriting, you know.
Collaborative process?
Unfortunately, with the kind of stuff I've been doing, not as collaborative as I'd like it to be, because I haven't done like any huge film yet where like I would like bring the music to an orchestra. But even that's only somewhat collaborative because they're just playing the arrangements that you've written. Mm-hmm. So it's very rare that you see two people working together on a score. It happens sometimes, but you know, because of technology, a lot of it is done just solo in front of your computer, and you're playing the oboes, the cellos, and the pizzicato violin parts and all of that yourself. So it's not as collaborative. It's collaborative in that you're working with a producer, a director, an engineer, and all that. It's collaborative in that way, but it's not collaborative where I'm working necessarily with other musicians that much. Now I might bring in a guitar player or a bass player here and there to do certain things, or a horn player. But it's not like when I used to make records and you had, the background vocalist came in, and the next day the guitar player was coming in, and the bass player was coming in. And it wasn't even always collaborative with record making either, but a good amount of the time, because of the nature of the artists I was working on, it was. Mm-hmm. But it's not as collaborative, the scoring, as I'd like it to be. You are working with other creatives. Mm-hmm. So I guess in that respect, it is collaborative.
And so are you thinking about other ways that you could do things maybe differently, focus on your own specific interests as you move forward in music?
Well, yeah, there's an interesting project I'm involved in, which is actually, I'm in a supporting role, but it's called Detour. And it was started by a guy named Ron Stodgill, who is a travel writer, but not in the way where he tells you the cool place to go to or the good food. A travel writer where most of his writing is more from a Black storyteller's narrative. And we're doing this project where he'll be creating, it's kind of like a digital, not just magazine or digital portal, but also there'll be podcasts, everything Black travel. So everything through a Black lens having to do with travel. But that means revisionist history about certain areas of the world that we have to rewrite the history or tell the truth about it. It means talking about the Black experience when traveling in certain places, maybe a little bit of the Green Book aspect involved. But there's going to be a video content, short form and longer form documentaries that we'll do, podcasts that we'll do. I'll be actually scoring a lot of that, but also I'll be producing some of the podcasts. So ultimately I get to finally bring all of my creative tools that I guess I've worked on through the years, from being an actor, producer, songwriter, artist, and be able to bring them in under one roof, which is what is exciting about it. So I'll be working with actors or other performers with podcasts and producing them. I'll be able to score the short form and long form documentaries or any kind of live action that we do. I'll probably be doing some VO work. So as I'll be using some of the acting chops, and I'm creative director, director of creative content for this enterprise. So it's kind of like a culmination of kind of like an opportunity to do a little bit of all of the things that I've enjoyed doing through the years under one roof, which I'm really excited about.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Gary, I can't tell you how delighted we are and honored that you took the time to be part of this Style Free podcast as our first guest.
I'm honored to have been your first guest.
Yes.
Thank you, man. I knew it'd be fun, man.